So if you familiarize yourself with monism and maybe you even kind of systemized um, some of the implications that are necessitated by, a monic system of reality, then you later read some of the, classical monists in history. You may have read Plotinus and kind of at times thought, uh, this kind of sounds off. This is a little bit contradictory. In fact, it kind of sounds like dualism, what he's talking about. And that will generally be Plotinus talking about matter and bodies, and evil. And Plotinus kind of conflates matter with evil, right? He kind of says matter is the principle of evil. Now, of course, this immediately doesn't really make a lot of sense because, if evil is a principle contrary to the good, and the good is essentially of God or of the absolute, of which ultimately there could be no privation of the absolute, right? There could be no, nothing that would contradict the nature of reality in itself, or the absolute. Because there's no privation of the absolute. At least that's how I define the absolute personally. So if that was the case, and essentially good refers to of the absolute, of, the one, then evil could not have a principal existence. It would essentially have to refer to something arbitrary, which would be okay, because even if that were the case, there are obviously certain things that could exist within the absolute that, wouldn't be optimal for a soul, or because the absolute would be endowed with a kind of self-configuration. We as, pluralized kind of individuations of the absolute's necessary nature, or souls, rather, would want to kind of exercise our agency and self-configure away from certain conditions. That's okay. It's okay for it to exist with some degree of importance without having principle, or without existing as a principle intrinsic to reality, or there being an arche of evil. But yeah, and for instance, another thing of Plotinus is that he, in my commentaries on the Enneads, which is on the blog, I'll link it below. It might be in my description as well, my channel description. But a big thing that Plotinus does is he has a kind of faulty dynamic between the soul and the body. It's kind of hylomorphic, but even Aristotle, once you get a little bit past the surface level of hylomorphism, kind of seems to suggest that bodies are very particular to a soul, whereas Plotinus almost goes for a more surface level, what someone might more on the surface level interpret with hylomorphism, which is just that the soul and body form a composite, right? There's this exterior principle to the soul, material, just matter, and the body kind of somewhat adheres to the soul to a greater or lesser degree. And the greater the degree to which it adheres to the soul, the more beautiful a composite will be, whether it's like a human being or, really anything, which is how he views beauty, which would imply that matter is something that is totally extrinsic to the soul, because it can, but of course it interacts with the soul, so, there must be some reconciling principle, but this dynamic kind of is one of opposition, right? Even if there's some syndiphonic, reconciling principle in the absolute. But then we'd have to question, where does matter come from? And it kind of seems like matter is suggested to not even be of the one by Plotinus. Or it's kind of characterized as non-being, as evil. Which, of course, doesn't make sense because, it is real. Even if we want to say it isn't real in itself, it has some existence. It is, like, if we were to say, for instance, that the material world is a kind of image, which I believe it is, or an illusion of sorts, then we just push the envelope further backwards and we have to determine the nature of that illusion. What is producing the illusion? There still must be a dynamic, an illusion producing dynamic, or an image producing dynamic. And if we kind of reveal or understand reality as mental, then an image producing dynamic between, the nous and matter, or the soul and matter, or mind and matter, more generally, that kind of makes a lot of sense, right? As matter, as kind of an image of the mind. The self-objectification of the subject. So yeah, and that makes a lot of sense. I mean, it should. We have minds that do that produce images kind of interiorly. But it was kind of revealed to me while participating in a reading group that Proclus, he kind of rectifies this position of Plotinus. But like I said, Neoplatonism is something that the inheritors developed as it goes along. And, actually speaking on that specifically, hopefully, Neoplatonism going forward doesn't kind of reify the people that we're inheriting the system from. And that could be said of any system, really. Because they certainly, made adjustments and continue to develop the system that they inherited. So we should continue in that tradition. I think a lot of people are probably rightfully reluctant to do that in a way, except in like certain cases, because it's easy to kind of just say that, yeah, these people were probably just smarter and better capable of thinking of these things than we are. But it could be the case that there are legitimate adjustments that could be made. They certainly did that, that's kind of how philosophy develops. But Proclus kind of rejects the Platonian notion that evil is a principle in itself and that principle is matter. He seems to kind of more identify it as a kind of subcontrary, and the way I would kind of understand that is, well, in the reading group, I believe the phrasing was basically a virtue would be, the subcontrary to that virtue would be a vice, which would be a good, would have a subcontrary of evil, which would basically kind of solve the problem of, reifying evil as a principle that is existent in itself. And rather, it is a kind of arbitrary thing that arises, that kind of defines the good, the particular good in question. And he kind of builds on that, or maybe not builds on that, but complements that with saying that evil cannot be spoken of as a principle in itself, but rather as a kind of plurality of things. Evil can really be only seen as, if it's not a principle existent in itself, of which there is an ultimate evil that all evils are kind of, emulating or a modulation thereof, that evils can only be spoken of as particulars because there's no universal. Which means it's kind of arbitrary, but I'll kind of touch on why it's still a useful thing. Proclus kind of rejects the Platinian notion, and we have this. I really like these ideas of, subcontraries, and the way I would kind of recognize that myself, or articulate it myself, would be that there is some defined good, some defined virtue, and that virtue is further defined by its opposition, in a manner kind of like determinatio est negatio, which means determination is negation. But let me kind of clarify that, because it's not exactly like that. It just reminds me of that. For instance, take a piece of paper, and like a white blank piece of paper, and draw a black square. In defining the black square on that piece of paper, you've also defined the white canvas with a little black cutout on it of a black square, or a square cutout, if that makes sense, right? So you have two shapes, in a sense. You have the negative image of the black square and the black square. One kind of defines the other, is how I'd kind of understand that myself, which kind of ties into my own kind of theory of definitionalism. That being said, yeah, Proclus is a good one, but matter and evil are kind of always spoken of in tandem, I noticed. So I think we really have to kind of get down to what matter is, and from what is matter produced, or is it produced? I'm not really exactly crystal clear on what even Plotinus says, much less Proclus or Aristotle say exactly, but I'm going to kind of go over some things I've heard. So it seems like matter could either be something that is a principle distinct from the kind of hypostatic procession, but still encapsulated by the one. It could be non-generated, which means it's kind of self-existent, which in my view, that kind of, means inherent contradiction. That means duality. Or it could be some kind of just non-existence, like it doesn't actually exist. I've heard it equated with non-being, but what that kind of becomes a question of is how, in my head, when I see non-being, it kind of immediately rings the bell of, okay, are you saying it's not real? Like, are we talking about unreality now? Or are we just talking about it doesn't have subjective being, as like, it is not living, it's not, it's mindless, it's just purely object. There's no subjectivity? Because if that's the case, and that's the definition of being as these people use it, then fine. In fact, that could be good, but I think it kind of, makes people think of non-being as in, like, unreal, like it is non-existent. And this will kind of bring us to my analysis of the, what the traditional, well, I kind of have surmised or apprehended the traditional, immaterial and material dynamic to be, and what my personal articulation of it is, and why I think it's better. At least, even if I'm just misconceiving what is meant to some degree, I don't think I'm doing it a whole lot, but if there is some degree to which I'm misconceiving what is meant, articulation is valuable. Re-articulating things when it is essentially the same thing that is meant is not, it can be worthwhile. So that would be the traditional one, would be kind of this hypostatic procession, right? We have the one, we have the nous, or I believe that's considered the same as the intellect. I'm not sure. It might go nous, intellect, soul, but it's something like that. And then I would assume that a lot of this kind of, on this emanationist model, where you have these kind of layers of emanation, which would, satisfy self-referentiality in a way, for sure. I'm assuming that some people view matter as kind of the continued procession, and that there's probably even a continued procession beyond matter, of which, we are not concerned, because it's not the layer of reality upon which we operate, if that makes sense. Which would kind of be to say that, material and immaterial natures are of the exact same quality, scaled differently. But that doesn't make a lot of sense, because, matter in itself does not have mind. It does not, it would be silly of us to even say that it has mentalizing properties, much less mental properties. So, but that would be to say that it is the exact same thing scaled differently. Now, what I would say instead is that material is a kind of, as I kind of touched on earlier, is a kind of image, which would mean, the way I like to describe this, and I'll kind of articulate it a little bit differently, is as subject-object dynamics, and we'll define subject as mind, subjectivity. The absolute can be considered a universal subjectivity. The one should be considered a universal subjectivity, and matter as object. And I'll even clarify this, because there's probably a better way I can articulate this, because if we were to look at matter as the self-objectification of a subject or subjectivity, then we shouldn't note it as an object, as an external. It would be totally internal and an intrinsic nature to that subjectivity, or at least, the self-objectification. A particular object is essentially the equivalent of an image in the imagination of the universal subjectivity. And then souls and this kind of hypostatic procession would arise because of self-referentiality, of course, which, it makes a whole lot of sense. Self-reference is necessary in a, self-contained, unified system. Whatever is real will, actually, even the system itself will, by necessity, refer to itself. So as that universal subjectivity kind of, or this universal divine mind, I suppose you could say, contemplates itself, which this contemplation is a self-definitive activity, right? It will be self-defining. It creates conditions, subjective conditions, and these conditions would be what creates an objectification, because these conditions create definition, and definition kind of necessitates an objectification. So the material world would be just the definition of these conditions, literally, the manifestation thereof. And subjectivity in itself is purely unmanifest, but this is just a much better way to think of the dynamic. And let's go back a little bit. The hypostatic procession, so that's essentially just the increasing particularization of the universal subjectivity or mind, which creates essentially souls. Of course, that would first create these kind of macrocosmic souls and increasingly microcosmic souls. So you'd have these kind of, this kind of aspective polytheism, which I'll touch on probably in another video, and all the way down to souls, and probably, again, there would be probably increasingly particularized souls that go forward from yours as well. And these souls would be related. There would definitely be a kind of relativity between them. Of course, they're all unmanifest, so you can see because the objectifications of the souls, i.e. bodies, are manifest. You can differentiate two in space and time, right? Spatially, you can see that two bodies are separate, but the souls themselves, you cannot see that, even though they are, in a way, for sure. But yeah, you'd still have this hypostatic procession of the purely subjective natures, and all subjective natures, or all subjectivity, would share in its nature of self-objectification, even the universal subjectivity. Or you could say, I would even be willing to entertain the universal subjectivity kind of maintaining its sovereignty, just as two souls maintain sovereignty, even though they're totally intrinsic and unified, intrinsic to the same system, that is. And, two gods would be unified utterly, but also, distinct in a way. So in that way, there could be perhaps a subjectivity that in itself does not self-objectify, but it would have to have this kind of self-objectifying capacity for the kind of preceding souls to even be able to do that. So we can't alienate this materializing nature from God, because then it is non-existent. Anything real has to have some principle rooted in the foundational reality principle, which we're saying is the absolute God. So I would say that kind of, in a way, certainly affirms the Proclus model of evil. And I think it's definitely a really good way of understanding material and immaterial dynamics, because as I kind of go through a lot of Neoplatonist stuff, I don't know, it seems like it's rarely made very clear, and sometimes it seems to kind of suggest that it's just a continued procession, as, souls are from the intellect or the demiurge, and as, the intellect and demiurge are from the one, which I think is not a correct assessment, if that's the case. And, I always want to, whenever I kind of comment on systems that aren't mine, even though, I obviously consider myself someone who's interacting with these systems and, learning and respecting them, learning from and respecting them, I always want to have a kind of disclaimer that, we could be misinterpreting, what they meant, because we're working with a different vernacular, even in translation, even if it wasn't, even if it was translated correctly, just the way they kind of string words together, or their syntax, and, their, perhaps the cultural understanding of words was a little bit different. So our understanding could very well be flawed, even with good translation. Although I suppose the best translation would kind of take that into account, but that I could imagine would be quite difficult to do. So, I always want to add a little disclaimer that I might also be missing information as far as, when I'm speaking on other systems, because, as of this video, I've talked about Plotinus, Proclus, and Aristotle, but I think that kind of covers everything I want to discuss. The problems I have with Plotinus, kind of an acknowledgement that it's corrected in later Neoplatonism with Proclus to some degree, although I'm not entirely clear on his view on matter. And we also talked about, I'm not sure if I already said Aristotle or not, but yeah. Yeah, mainly I kind of wanted to compare the kind of hypostatic procession versus an imaginary dynamic, because essentially this subject-object dynamic I talked about is basically matter as the self-image of the mind, which I think is a lot more coherent, like even just like the way and the time I took to describe it, even if there is something similar like to that in Neoplatonism that I haven't uncovered, which I would love to. It's a very straightforward way of understanding it, and I think it's fairly succinct. But yeah, kind of random, very, very particular conversation. I kind of want to talk later about how hypostatic procession, i.e. like kind of hypostases proceeding from the one, would work in such a model. It would just be subjectively, right? It would be basically the individuation of souls as increasingly particularizations, or increasingly particular minds, I suppose, that kind of creates this plurality of minds in another video. But thank you for listening, and have